Right now, anything can happen. Right here, everything can change. It is time, cast all your cares upon Him. Right now, right here, no fear. Don't fret, just run into His presence. Just know He's got every single tear. Be cleansed in the holy reign of Jesus. Right here, right now, no fear. Just turn your eyes upon Jesus. Turn your eyes upon Jesus. Turn your eyes upon Jesus. Right here, right now, no fear. Take heart, His name is your defender. Be glad and know that He is God. Don't wait, just run into His presence. Right here, right now, no fear. Just turn your eyes upon Jesus. Turn your eyes upon Jesus. Turn your eyes upon Jesus. Right here, right now, no fear. Fear not, for He is good. Fear not, for He is God. Just look to the Savior, for He is overcome it all. Fear not, for He is good. Turn your eyes upon Jesus. Turn your eyes upon Jesus. Turn your eyes upon Jesus. Right here, right now, no fear.
Westside, we're so glad you joined us for another online service, but we want to continue to remind you that we have begun gathering in person again. And most recently, the city has lifted its mask bylaw, and so I want to give you just a quick update of what that's going to mean and what you can experience if you decide to join us within the space. The first is that masks are no longer required when you attend on a Sunday, but AHS would strongly recommend that masks are still worn within large groups and for people you don't always know their medical history with. So the decision is yours, but they're no longer required. What that means for us as a staff, though, is that from the beginning we have said we want to continue to care for the vulnerable and show love for our neighbor. And so as a staff and as volunteers, you will continue to see us wearing masks as a response to this, of our best way and best understanding of how we want to move forward during this time. We want to invite you to participate with us in whatever way that you feel most comfortable. So there will still be hand sanitizer found throughout the facility, as well as masks if you would like to have one when you join us. We hope to see you at a service soon. We also want to let you know that our July menu is continuing to roll out, and there's a few events that we would like to highlight for you. The first is that we have a short circle that's starting Monday, July 12th, that goes along with our big read for the summer. That's going to start this Monday with David and myself. We would love to see you online. We also have Breaking Bread dinner, which is a multi-generational women's gathering and supper together, and we would love to see many women connected to that. And we also have a mom and caregivers play group that's meeting on Wednesday mornings to be together and to share in life and in conversations. For all of the information regarding these events and to register, head to wkc.org/menu.
We're going to start our new series for the summer today. In this series, I want to ask questions about how we see the world and how we make sense of the world, particularly as Jesus followers. How do we see the world? Now, I've worn glasses for quite some time. In fact, this past year, I had to change my glasses. And this led me into that familiar phenomena where on one hand, I had to pick new glasses, always a process that requires me staring in the mirror much more than I am comfortable with, and always difficult because I often liked my old glasses, right? But then a second part of this phenomena of finding new glasses is becoming comfortable with the new lenses, becoming comfortable with the new prescription, with your new vision. See, because when you get new glasses, even though your vision is now corrected, you've now got the glasses that suit where your eyes are at, it doesn't quite feel right initially. The old, the faulty, that feels familiar and correct. Now, I realize that this sermon has really begun by appealing to the middle-aged amongst us right now, so apologies to all of you with perfect 2020 vision. But I have this sort of ridiculous habit where I tend towards keeping my old glasses. The KonMari method has failed when it comes to that. Like, I know that we're supposed to be minimalists and we're supposed to trim our lives down, but I find myself keeping them. I don't actually know why I do this. Like, what am I expecting? Like, are my eyes going to get better at some point, and therefore I can go and use those old glasses? My optometrist tells me, he assures me that this is not going to happen. Like, is it familiarity? Is it comfort? Is it that somehow there's something about me, maybe about all of us, that we just don't like changing how we see things? Do we like changing our perspectives? Do we like looking at things differently? Are we prepared to accept that how we were perceiving things, how we were looking at things, wasn't quite right? In Mark chapter 8 and verse 17, Jesus asks his disciples a series of questions about perspective. And one of the questions Jesus asks is, do you have eyes but fail to see? Do you have eyes but fail to see? Chapter 8 of Mark then continues into a story that I want us to look at today. I'm going to read it. It's from verse 22 of Mark chapter 8. The story says this. It says, they came, that's Jesus and his disciples, they came to Bethsaida. And some people brought a man who was blind and begged Jesus to touch him. He took the man who was blind by the hand and led him outside the village. And when he had spit on the man's eyes, he put his hands on him. And Jesus asked, do you see anything? He looked up and said, I see people, they look like trees walking around. Once more, Jesus put his hands on the man's eyes, and then his eyes were opened. His sight was restored, and he saw everything clearly. Jesus sent him home, saying, don't even go into the village. Now, there are many things you could say about this story, and I think one of them you almost have to say is that this story is strange. Like Jesus spits in a man's face. I mean, that's more than a little gross. Even if it's Jesus' spit, it's probably not something you wake up in the morning wanting to happen to you. But this story, with all of this strangeness around its healing, I'd love you just to spot something at the end of the story. Before we say anything else about it, just spot what happens at the end. Notice that after Jesus has performed this miracle, he doesn't make a sensation out of this. He keeps this miracle quiet. There's no messianic fanfare. There's no sense of, wow, who is this Jesus and what has this Jesus done? Why do you think it's important that Jesus keeps this quiet? You see, I wonder if it's because Jesus is showing us not simply that he can do miracles, but he's showing us how he does miracles, how he works. Jesus has power, Jesus has truth, but he doesn't use them in the way that his wider society does. Jesus is different. He sees and he looks at things differently. So we can say, well, Jesus is powerful, but that's not quite seeing clearly how Jesus is. You can have eyes, but not see. Because how is Jesus powerful? Is it different from us? So from that perspective then, notice how this miracle works. Working backwards from what we've just said, notice that the miracle sort of happens in two stages. The man is healed. Jesus spits on the man in his eyes, and the man is kind of healed. Jesus says, can you see? He says, well, he kind of says, I can kind of see. I can see people, but they look like trees. So he's healed, but he can't see clearly. So Jesus touches him again, and then he is able to see, as Mark tells us, clearly. Like you can have eyes and not see. So what if this miracle is working as something of a parable for us as readers of it? Is this miracle a sort of metaphor of the process of following Jesus? Like, think about it like this. Is it possible to follow Jesus, but see your following of Jesus as exclusively about your salvation? Am I saved? Am I not saved? What happens when I die? Is it possible to narrow Jesus down to just that? Is it possible to love Jesus and believe in Jesus, but that not make any impact on how you see the world or behave in the world? The man who is blind says, I see people. They look like trees. He has eyes, but he cannot see clearly. Does Jesus simply bring clarity to our lives? Or is Jesus also the lens through which we see and make sense of the world? And that's the question that I want to ask in this new series that we start today. See, like that man in the story, are many of us partially impacted by Jesus? Has Jesus affected us to an extent? Like we can see some, but not clearly. Or perhaps do we know, like me with my new glasses, that putting on the new lenses will change how I see, and that's going to be strange for a little while. So I might just step away from that. Essentially, in this series, I want to ask questions about the second part of this miracle. Like, not can we see, but how do we see? The question of can you see can sometimes be simply answered yes or no, but then when we ask how, we say, well, I can see people, they look like trees. Hey, how do Jesus' followers see the world? How do we perceive the world? How do we make sense of it? How do we construct our beliefs about what's right, what's wrong, about how things are? And we want to ask these questions throughout this series alongside our big read book for the summer, which is N.T. Wright's book, Broken Signposts, and then also the short circle that's accompanying that starting this week. And the premise essentially of the questions we want to ask this summer are this. Following Jesus, it doesn't transport us from one world to another. Jesus doesn't swap us out from a broken world into a fixed world just because we believe in him. Jesus doesn't offer us an escape route. Rather, following Jesus gives us a way to make sense of the world that we're in. If the world were a puzzle, Jesus would help us make sense of the pieces. So when we think of some of the features of the world, the big issues of our world, things that we know we need to get right, questions of justice or love, spirituality, beauty, freedom, what about truth or power? Like, these things are fundamentally important to our world. They matter to almost everybody in some way. We know that these things exist and are questions for everybody, whether they follow Jesus or not. And Jesus followers don't have the monopoly on these things. But our brokenness has a tendency to distort them. We don't quite see them correctly. Or we tend to prioritize some and ignore the others, and we end up in unhealthy situations because we focus on one and not the other. We turn these aspects of the world into sort of distorted echoes of what they should be. They sound almost right, but just not quite. So the question really is, how do we hold these things together? How do we make sense of them? If justice and love, spirituality, beauty, freedom, truth, and power are all things that point us towards the divine, then how do we practice those things in a way that's in sync with God? How do we avoid having power without any truth, or justice without love? Both of these can be highly destructive realities if we encounter them. Now, the writers of the Bible understood this tension, and one writer in particular guides us on this. His name is John. Now, how John makes sense of the world is that he re-storyfies it. Now, that sounds like a little bit of a made-up word, so let me just jump into that for a moment. To storyfy something is to describe concepts or ideas, but in story form. So we tell a story to make sense of something. And John comes to a story, that already does that. John comes to something which has been storyfied, and he does it again. Let me show you what he does. If you turn to the very beginning of John's Gospel, notice how he begins. He says, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. Through him all things were made. Without him nothing was made that has been made. In him was life, and that life was the light of all mankind. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it." Now, John does something phenomenal here. For a Jewish audience in the first century, this story is really familiar, because it's the creation story. If you're hearing this in the first century, in the beginning, you immediately are drawn to Genesis. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. It's a familiar story. We know this story, John. We grew up learning this story. Our parents taught us this story. But John says, in the beginning was the Word. He tells the story differently. He re-storyfies an idea that we already knew. He retells the story of how God made the world. How does he do it, though? He does it by inserting Jesus into the center of the story. If you know the Genesis account, you don't recall seeing Jesus there, but now John tells you the story and says this whole creation was done in Jesus. N.T. Wright phrases it well like this. He says, part of the Christian faith from the start has always been the conviction that the God revealed in and through Jesus is precisely the creator of the world, and that he has promised to put it right. So John re-storyfies the story of the world by showing that Jesus is central to making sense of the story. It's as if he goes, you thought you knew how this story worked, but now I'm going to show you when you place Jesus in the center of this story starts to make sense. The world starts to make sense. Justice, love, spirituality, all these things continue in their brokenness unless we place Jesus at the center of the story. So this is a Christian confession. Jesus becomes the key, the central point to understanding the issues of the world. This position, it sort of reminds me of C.S. Lewis's famous comment. Lewis, famously at his conversion, when asked why he had become a Christian, Lewis said this. He said, I believe in Christianity as I believe that the sun has risen, not only because I see it, but because by it I see everything else. So think about what Lewis is saying and how that relates to what we've got going on in this talk today. Lewis is saying that there's one way to understand the sun is risen, and that is purely to look directly at the sun. Another way to understand that the sun is risen is by realizing that you can see everything else. And it feels to me like he's riffing alongside John's gospel when he says that. For John, how do we make sense of the world? Well, we can do two things. We can live in the world and simply look at God, or we can understand that Jesus is the creator of this world, that everything is formed and created through him, and therefore, we not only look at Jesus, but we look through Jesus. We use Jesus glasses, Jesus lenses to make sense of everything else that we see. Now, notice then what John does. A few verses further on in the opening of his gospel, he drops this verse to us. Verse 14 of John chapter 1. The Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. In Eugene Peterson's translation of John chapter 1, he says the Word kind of moved into the neighborhood. And that's the story that John wants to tell us. He wants to tell us this kind of two-level story. On one hand, Jesus is the key to the whole story. He's there at the beginning. Nothing's been made that he wasn't involved in. He is this creation God. He's putting everything together. John's like, you've never heard the story like this before, but this is how the story actually goes. He re-storyfies it for us. But not only is Jesus key to the whole story, now John throws us another angle. He says Jesus is also present in this story, what we call the incarnation, that somehow the creator of the story is now an actor in the story. And this is worth paying attention to. Because, you see, it's hard to make sense of the world. Like I know that. I look at the news media, as I look at the stories that are happening around about me, and I find myself increasingly in conversation with people, and we talk about the world's issues, and the same thing is repeated on a regular basis. Goodness, I'm not sure how you fix that. I'm not sure how you solve this. It is hard to make sense of our world. It's hard to make sense of this point in history. And sometimes what we do then, because it's hard, is we suppose that if we just lived in a different time or place, if we were able to be elsewhere, then perhaps it would be easier to follow Jesus. We see people yearning for the past, or yearning for different eras, or yearning for different countries, and saying, oh, well, if we were there, it would all make much more sense. But John's telling of the story, the way he begins and changes the story, it upsets all of that for us. John says, don't think like that. Forget about wondering about how you would do if you were in a different point of history. Why? Well, because Jesus was in the neighborhood. The Word became flesh and dwelt amongst us. Jesus was here, and so are you. This is the point you find yourself in. And the goal of following Jesus is not to dream of a better time or a better place, but is to ask, how do I make sense as a Jesus follower of where I live and how the world is right now? So it's a retold story. It's a different story, but our call is to live it out here. So we look at issues of justice or spirituality or love, power, truth. Regardless of where we find ourselves, we look at these issues through the lens of Jesus at the center. And that's what I want to focus on for our summer. So we're going to lean into this over the coming weeks. But as we do that, let me ask you a question about story. Perhaps, let me say it more honestly, let me ask you a question about your story. If Jesus is going to call us to think differently about the world, to think differently about making sense of our society, perhaps one of the things we need to begin with is asking, how do we make sense of our own story? Does your own story need to be re-storyfied? Does it need to be rewritten? Like, what are the bits of your story that don't make sense, that aren't working, that aren't happening for you right now? And I think this is the question from John's Gospel, chapter 1. It's presented to us like this: that if you can take an old familiar story and rewrite it to show that Jesus is present within it and present with us now, perhaps the question that John wants us to ask is, how could your story be rewritten? How would your story look with Jesus at the center? How would you see your story if you realized that Jesus was at the center already and you just needed to look at it differently? Perhaps an easier way to ask that question is, how are you telling the story of your life right now? When you tell your story, how does it go? Is it told from a Jesus perspective? Do you tell your story with an awareness that Jesus has been central the whole time and has never abandoned you or left you? Or does your story form a different way? Is your story like, well, I have eyes, but I can't quite see clearly? Is your story a distorted echo of the tale that Jesus wants us to tell? And that's what I want to invite you into today as we head out into this series, is if we're going to make sense of the world, if we're going to try and make sense of our society and the time that we live in, then first we must just spend a little bit of time making sense of what's being given to us, making sense of the life that we have. It might be a bad life, it might be a good life, it might be, like most of us, a mixture of both. But can we tell that story, noticing Jesus and where he fits in it, making sense of it all? So I invite you to join us as we journey through this summer. And may you find that when we set Jesus at the center, the story of life, the story of your life, and the world starts to make more sense. And as we do that, as always, may you find his grace and peace is with you.